I'm going to show you how to use 4 main techniques using ink. The first technique that I will show you is wet on dry. So I'm just using black ink, diluted slightly with water, and I'm applying it directly on the paper using brush. Notice how it produces very sharp and clean edges. So with this technique, you have a lot more control of ink compared to some other techniques. The second technique I will show you is wet on wet. So for this technique, I am going to apply clean water on the paper using brush. When you do this, be careful not to put too much water, because what happens with too much water is that it can potentially make your paper warp. Next, I'm going to apply undiluted ink straight onto that wet surface. Notice how it naturally diffuses and creates these ripple-like effects on the water. If I use diluted ink, the value is less intense, but it creates the same effect. With this technique, you have less control over the medium, but it allows you to create more uncontrolled, spontaneous marks that is really fun to do. I'm going to try one more time. This time I'm applying long patch of water, clean water, and then I'm just going to drag diluted ink right across. This goes in along with some of the surrealist techniques that surrealists explored. It allows you to create uncontrolled marks, and then from there they come up with an imagery in mind and then start adding more intentional mark making. The next technique I'm showing you is wet into wet. So first of all, I applied a patch of undiluted India ink, and then I'm just continuing to add clean water along the edge. My intention is to create a soft gradation. Okay, so as I'm adding water, notice how the value is getting lighter, and I'm just working wet into wet surface. Okay, see how adding the ink in the front of that water patch increases the value, but it doesn't create stark edge. Instead, it enables all the paint to blend well together. Okay, now on the same patch of paint, I am going to show you how to use the dry brush to create some blending. Okay, so my intention is to get rid of that hard edge. So what I'm doing is I am cleaning my brush straight into the clean water container and then taking off all the excess water. So with dry brush, I'm basically taking off a layer of ink that's already on the surface. I'm taking off the wet paint with dry brush and then cleaning my brush on the paper towel or rag right after. Okay, so in a way, this is kind of like the kneaded eraser technique on top of charcoal. The only time you can erase ink is while it's still wet. So you can use dry brush technique to erase or wipe off a layer of ink while it's still wet. Okay, finally, I'm going to show you how you can layer using the first technique, wet on dry. So on top of that patch of paint, I am going to layer another paint stroke with diluted ink. So see how you still see the underneath layer, but I'm just creating another intentional layer on top of that patch. So using this wet on dry technique, if you wait enough between each layer, you can continue to build layer very softly. The key to this is waiting between each layer for things to dry. Another technique you can use is using the hair dryer to allow layers to dry quickly. Eric from our class had a question about painting water ripples using ink, so I'm going to demonstrate how you can do that using the 4 techniques. First, I'm going to apply clean water directly on the surface. And then I'm going to use some diluted ink just to capture the shadows of the water ripple. It has a round contour shape, so make sure to follow the contour line that you see in the picture or that you have in your head. Okay, so this technique that I'm showing right now is a dry brush technique. I'm using combination of wet on wet, wet into wet, and the dry brush technique to create the shadows as I control the edges. Areas where you want more harsh edge, you can use the diluted ink and do wet on dry technique. Areas where you want diffused edge or the soft edge, try to use wet on wet or wet into wet. So here I would like to define the shadows a little bit. So after drying with a hair dryer, I'm going in back with thinner brush and then creating more drastic shadows. And then I'm just going to layer the water ripples with the 2 legs. Okay, now is the time to paint the reflection. When painting reflection, follow the cross contour of the water ripple. Now I'm taking white gel pen to define the edges of my focal point, which are the 2 legs. And then bringing out the edges of the highlights on the water ripple and the shadows. Notice that I'm still following the cross contour of the water ripple, but I'm starting to add the horizontal strokes because in fact the plane of the water is going horizontally, which is parallel to your horizon line. So I'm using a lot of the angles that are horizontal going straightward, this time using pen and ink. If you don't have your bamboo pen, feel free to try any kind of ink pen such as micron pen or even black ballpoint pen if you have no other option. Okay, I'm doing the same thing again using white gel pen, adding some cross hatching marks and hatching marks following the horizontal plane of water. Next, I'm going to show you how to paint the forest from this picture. Okay, so again, I'm using the wet on wet technique. Okay, notice that I have these diffuse edges that are kind of out of my control, but I think that's the beauty of using ink. So let happy accidents happen when you try this technique. And don't be so focused on replicating an image or try to have a perfect edge. After drying that initial layer, I'm just using the diluted ink once again to make my initial layer more even. Okay, so after the two initial layers, I thought I was looking at my image and I thought it would be really nice to create some trees in the background. I really enjoy the ink technique because it allows me to be more creative. The water kind of flows itself and the ink on top of wet surface does its own thing, and the after image allows me to be more imaginative and kind of suggests me what the next step is. So in this case, I thought I would like to draw in the trees using the white gel pen. I'm adding another layer to deepen the value of the sky and the water. Drawing with the hairdryer again, and then finally with pen and ink, I'm adding these birds in the sky. Okay, the last technique that I would like to share with you is how to draw the dog walking on the water. So I'm quickly sketching using my 2B pencil. You can use your HB pencil for this. It's a really rough sketch. Afterwards, I'm just painting. This time I'm painting straight with brush, wet on dry technique. But I'm painting quickly enough so that I can be conscious of the edges and if needed, blend them out with water. Okay, so I'm trying to distinguish the values into three main values: highlight, halftone, and shadow. And using pen, I'm adding the hair texture. Make sure to allow the underneath layer to dry completely before you do this step. Then using the diluted ink, I'm creating the halftone ground on top of all the shadows that I've created. And then just working on wet to create more natural appearance on top of the water surface. Once that layer dries, you can go back in with pen to add more intentional marks and details. The most important thing about working with ink is for you to have fun and allow the spontaneous things to happen on the surface. So using the 4 techniques I shared, try to explore those techniques and don't be afraid to make mistakes, because normally most of times these mistakes turn into happy accidents and allows your creativity to unleash. So I hope you enjoy working with ink. And just to remind you again, this project doesn't have to be done using ink only. Feel free to incorporate other materials that you learned throughout the semester. Thank you. Happy drawing!